On the morning of June 3, 1982, Robert James Caldwell stood in the foyer of his home in McLean, Virginia, holding a manila envelope that had been delivered by private courier 17 minutes earlier. The envelope was unmarked except for his name typed on a white label, the letters produced by what appeared to be an older manual typewriter. There was no return address. The postmark indicated Vienna, Austria, though the date stamp was smudged beyond precise identification. He tore open the seal and pulled out a photograph. For several seconds, he simply stared at the image, his mind struggling to reconcile what his eyes were seeing. The photograph showed a woman standing on a concrete sidewalk in front of a drab apartment building, the architectural style unmistakably Soviet, one of those repetitive housing blocks built during the Khrushchev era. In the background, partially visible at the edge of the frame, was a sign with Cyrillic lettering. The woman was Elena, his wife. Robert's breath caught. He stepped backward, his shoulder brushing against the wall, and looked at the photograph again, searching for some indication that he was mistaken. But there was no mistake. The angle of her jaw, the set of her shoulders, the way she held her head slightly tilted when she smiled, all of it was Elena. Her hair was styled differently than she wore it now, shorter and darker, the way it had been in the early 1970s. She was wearing a heavy wool coat, dark and shapeless, and her expression was neutral, almost resigned. On either side of Elena stood two boys, both appearing to be in their early teens. They were dressed in simple clothes, jackets that looked slightly too large, trousers that had been worn and mended. The boys stared directly at the camera, their faces serious, their eyes dark and unsmiling. Neither of them resembled the children Robert and Elena had raised together. These boys were strangers. Robert turned the photograph over. The back was blank except for a developer's mark and a date printed in faint ink, April 1974. Robert Caldwell was 52 years old, a signals intelligence specialist employed by Advanced Systems Research Corporation, which held classified contracts with the National Security Agency and the Department of Defense. He had held a top-secret security clearance since 1967, a designation that required exhaustive background checks, periodic polygraph examinations, and continuous evaluation of his conduct. His career had been built on precision, on the understanding that small details mattered and that overlooking a single inconsistency could compromise an entire operation. He walked into the kitchen and set the photograph on the counter beside the coffee maker. The house was quiet. Elena had left an hour earlier to drive their son to school and then continued to her part-time position at a community library in Falls Church. Robert poured himself coffee, though his hands were unsteady and he spilled a small amount on the IP counter. He wiped it up with a dishcloth, his movements automatic, his mind trying to construct a narrative that would explain the photograph. Elena Caldwell, born Elena Kowalska, had come to the United States in 1958. Part of a wave of Polish refugees who had fled Eastern Europe following the Hungarian Revolution. She had arrived in New York with little more than a suitcase and a sponsorship letter from a Catholic relief organization. Robert had met her in 1960 at a dinner party in Arlington where Elena had been working as a secretary for a law firm handling immigration cases. They had married in June 1961 and Elena had transitioned smoothly into the role of an American wife, learning English with impressive speed and raising their children with a combination of European discipline and American optimism. Robert had never questioned her background in any serious way. She spoke occasionally about her childhood in Krakow, about the difficulties of growing up in Soviet-controlled territory, about poverty and fear. But she had never offered details and Robert had never pressed, assuming her reluctance was natural for someone who had survived trauma. Now staring at the photograph, he realized how little he actually knew about the years before Elena had arrived in America. He spent the next 3 hours searching the house. He moved through each room methodically, opening drawers, examining closets, checking the backs of cabinets. In the bedroom, he found her jewelry box and carefully removed each piece, looking for hidden compartments. There were none. In the study, he went through the filing cabinet containing birth certificates, tax returns, and mortgage papers. Elena's naturalization certificate was there, dated 1963 along with her social security card. Everything appeared legitimate. But legitimacy, Robert knew from his work, could be manufactured. In the garage, tucked behind boxes of Christmas decorations, Robert found a small leather suitcase he had never seen before. It was old, the leather cracked and faded, the brass clasps tarnished. He pulled it out and opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in Polish and postmarked from various cities in Poland and the Soviet Union, the dates ranging from the early 1960s to as recently as 1980. There were also several photographs of people Robert didn't recognize, and a small notebook filled with handwritten entries in a language he couldn't read. Robert sat on the garage floor and understood that the woman he had been married to for more than 2 decades had maintained an entire correspondence, an entire connection to a world she had claimed to have left behind, and she had done so in complete secrecy. He carried the suitcase back into the house and placed it on the dining room table, the photograph from Vienna positioned beside it. The decision formed slowly, not as a sudden revelation but as the inevitable conclusion of everything he had discovered that morning. He would confront Elena that evening when she returned home. He would show her the photograph, present the suitcase, and demand an explanation. The conversation began at 10:47 in the evening, approximately 23 minutes after their son had gone upstairs to his bedroom and closed the door. Robert had waited, sitting in the living room with the photograph and the leather suitcase positioned on the coffee table in front of him, listening to the sounds of the house settling into its nightly routine. The television had been turned off. The dishwasher had completed its cycle in the kitchen. Elena had been moving about upstairs, her footsteps audible through the ceiling as she prepared for bed. When she came downstairs wearing a cotton nightgown and a thin robe, she found Robert sitting in the dim light of a single lamp, his posture rigid, his hands folded in his lap. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to concern as she registered the photograph on the table. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of traffic on the parkway and the irregular ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Robert gestured toward the photograph. He informed her that it had arrived that morning by courier from Vienna. He asked her to explain what it was, who the boys were, and why she was standing in front of a Soviet apartment building in 1974 when she had told him she was visiting her cousin in Chicago. Elena's face drained of color. She stepped forward slowly, her hand reaching out to grip the back of the armchair for support. She looked down at the photograph with an expression that Robert would later describe to federal investigators as recognition mixed with resignation. Her lips parted, but no words came immediately. She swallowed and shook her head, less like denial and more like an attempt to clear away panic. She claimed it wasn't what it looked like. She insisted there was a reasonable explanation, that the photograph was old, that it had been taken before she came to America. But Robert had spent more than 15 years analyzing deception in classified communications. He could hear the strain in Elena's voice, the slight tremor that betrayed the effort required to maintain the facade. He reached down and opened the leather suitcase, pulling out the stack of letters postmarked from Poland and the Soviet Union, some as recent as 18 months ago. He placed them on the table and asked her again to explain. Elena's denials crumbled within 3 minutes. She sat down heavily, her hands trembling as she pressed them against her face, and the words began to emerge in broken fragments. She told him that her real name was not Elena Kowalska, but Elena Dmitrievna Volkov, that she had been born not in Krakow but in Minsk, and that she had never been a refugee fleeing Soviet oppression. She had been recruited by the KGB in 1957 when she was 20 years old and working as a translator at a government ministry in Moscow. The KGB had approached her with photographs of her 2 sons, Alexei and Viktor, who were then 6 and 4 years old, living with Elena's mother in a small apartment outside Minsk. The officer who conducted the recruitment interview had explained that Elena possessed qualities that made her valuable to the state. She spoke fluent English. She was intelligent, adaptable, and capable of maintaining composure under pressure. And most importantly, she was a mother, which meant she understood what was at stake when the officer placed the photographs of her sons on the desk and informed her that their safety, their education, their future, all depended on her willingness to serve the Soviet Union. The mission had been straightforward. Elena was to be inserted into the United States under cover of a Polish refugee, a story common enough in the late 1950s to avoid scrutiny. She was provided with forged documents, a manufactured backstory about a childhood in Krakow that had never occurred, and instructions to establish herself in the Washington area and cultivate relationships with men who held or were likely to obtain security clearances. The ultimate objective was marriage, the kind of long-term penetration that would provide the KGB with access to classified information for years, without the vulnerabilities associated with short-term assets. Robert listened without interrupting, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. Elena's voice wavered as she described meeting him in 1960, the dinner party in Arlington that had seemed spontaneous but had been arranged through a contact at the law firm where she worked. She admitted that their courtship had been calculated, that her interest in his work had not been innocent curiosity but systematic information collection required by her handlers. She claimed she had resisted at first, that she had tried to provide only minimal intelligence. But the pressure had been relentless. Photographs of her sons would arrive periodically, always accompanied by implicit reminders of what would happen if Elena failed to meet expectations. The intelligence she had passed over 20 years included technical specifications for encrypted communication systems, details about personnel with security clearances who might be vulnerable to recruitment, information about contract negotiations between defense firms and government agencies, and assessments of American capabilities in signals intelligence that Robert had discussed with her during moments of professional frustration. She had photographed documents when Robert brought work home. She had memorized conversations and reconstructed them in written reports delivered through dead drops at shopping centers and public parks. She had lived 2 lives simultaneously, one as the devoted American wife, the other as an active KGB asset. When Elena finished speaking, the silence returned. Robert asked her if she loved him, if anything about their marriage had been real, if their children meant anything to her beyond their utility as cover. Elena's response came in a whisper. She said yes, that somewhere along the way the performance had become real, that she had not anticipated falling in love with the man she had been assigned to deceive. But Robert was no longer certain he could believe anything she said. What Elena did not know was that Robert had activated a tape recorder before she had come downstairs, a small device concealed inside the bookshelf behind his chair. He had made the decision that afternoon, understanding that whatever happened next would require evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. The tape would capture Elena's admission of espionage, the details of her recruitment, her handlers, and the methods she had used over 2 decades. Robert stood up slowly and informed Elena that they would discuss what came next in the morning. He walked upstairs to the guest bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness. He did not sleep that night. By dawn, he had made his decision. Robert Caldwell did not go to work on the morning of June 4, 1982. He called his supervisor at Advanced Systems Research Corporation at 7:15, his voice deliberately hoarse, and reported that he had come down with what felt like severe flu. The lie came easily, though the physical symptoms he described were not entirely fabricated. His head ached from lack of sleep. His stomach was unsettled. His hands trembled when he held the phone. Elena had left the house before dawn, claiming she needed to clear her head, that she would stay with a friend for a few days. Robert had not asked which friend or where. He had simply watched through the bedroom window as she backed her car out of the driveway and disappeared down the street, the taillights fading into the gray morning mist. The house felt different in her absence, larger and emptier. The first thing Robert did after hanging up was return to the living room where the tape recorder still sat on the bookshelf, the cassette inside containing the entire conversation from the previous night. He rewound the tape and played it back, listening to Elena's voice admitting that her real name was Elena Dmitrievna Volkov, that she had been recruited by the KGB in 1957, that their marriage had been an assigned mission. The words sounded even more surreal in the cold light of morning, reduced to simple declarative statements that could be transcribed and presented as evidence. Robert spent the next several hours reviewing their entire marriage through the lens of espionage. He pulled out photograph albums from the hall closet and flipped through the pages slowly, examining images from their wedding, from the births of their children, from family vacations. In every photograph, Elena smiled with what appeared to be genuine warmth. But now Robert found himself analyzing each image for signs of deception. He could not find them. Either Elena had been an extraordinarily skilled actress, or some part of what she had expressed had been real. He recalled specific moments with new understanding. In 1967, when Robert had been offered a position with higher security clearance that required relocating to California, Elena had encouraged him to turn it down, arguing that the children were too young to uproot. At the time, Robert had appreciated her perspective. Now he understood that Elena's advice had been calculated to keep him in the Washington area, where her KGB handlers could maintain consistent contact. He remembered Elena's interest in his work, the questions she would ask over dinner about projects he was developing, about colleagues, about security protocols. He had interpreted her curiosity as supportive engagement. Now those conversations replayed in his memory as interrogations, carefully structured elicitations designed to extract information without triggering suspicion. There had been absences too, weekend trips Elena had taken alone, claiming she needed to visit friends or attend conferences. Robert had never questioned these departures. Now he wondered if those weekends had been used for meetings with handlers, for training sessions, for transfers of materials that could not be passed through dead drops. The thought that drove him back to the garage that afternoon was the realization that if Elena had been operating as a KGB asset for 20 years, there would be physical evidence beyond the letters and photographs. Professional intelligence officers used equipment, tools, materials that enabled secure transmission of information, and if Elena had been as careful as her confession suggested, she would have hidden those materials somewhere accessible but not obvious. Robert began his search in the same corner where he had found the leather suitcase. He moved boxes, opened containers of old paint and gardening supplies, checked behind shelving units. It took 40 minutes before he found what he was looking for. The old metal toolbox sat on a high shelf near the ceiling, dusty and unremarkable. Robert pulled it down and set it on his workbench. The weight was wrong, too heavy for the tools it supposedly contained. Inside, beneath a shallow tray holding rusted implements, was a shortwave radio, compact and well-maintained, with frequency dials marked in Cyrillic characters. Beside it lay a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be microdots, tiny photographic reductions of documents that could be concealed under postage stamps. There were also several sheets of paper covered in 5-digit number groups, the classic format for one-time pad encryption used by Soviet intelligence services. Robert stood in the dim light of the garage and felt the full weight of his complicity settling over him. For 20 years he had lived with a woman who had been stealing classified information from his home, his briefcase, his conversations. And whether through willful blindness or carelessness, he had enabled that theft by discussing sensitive work matters in an unsecured environment, by bringing documents home that should never have left his office. He had failed the vigilance his security clearance required. The decision crystallized over the course of that afternoon. Robert understood that he had three options. He could remain silent, destroy the evidence, and hope that whoever had sent the photograph would not escalate the exposure. He could confront Elena again and demand cooperation with American intelligence. Or he could report everything to the FBI immediately and accept whatever consequences followed. The first option was untenable. Remaining silent would make him an active accomplice. The second option assumed Elena would betray her handlers, contradicted by her statement that her sons remained hostages to her cooperation. The third option, while personally devastating, was the only path that offered any possibility of protecting himself and his children from prosecution as accessories. Robert sat at the kitchen table as darkness fell outside, the tape recorder and the contents of the toolbox arranged in front of him. At 9:30 in the evening, he picked up the telephone and dialed the FBI's Washington field office. When the duty officer answered, Robert identified himself and stated that he needed to report a matter of national security involving a suspected Soviet intelligence operative. The duty officer's tone shifted immediately. Robert was instructed to remain at his home and to expect agents within the hour. He hung up and waited in the silence. The two FBI agents who arrived at Robert Caldwell's home at 11:03 on the evening of June 4, 1982 were not the last he would see that night. They were advance personnel, tasked with securing the residence and conducting a preliminary assessment of the materials Robert had described over the phone. They moved through the house with practiced efficiency, photographing the tape recorder, the contents of the toolbox, the letters from the leather suitcase. They asked Robert to provide a written statement detailing the events of the previous 48 hours, and they informed him that a senior counterintelligence officer would arrive within 2 hours to take operational control of the case. Special Agent Margaret Devereaux arrived at 1:37 in the morning, stepping out of an unmarked sedan accompanied by 3 additional agents and a technical specialist carrying equipment cases. Devereaux was 41 years old, a veteran of the FBI's Soviet Counterintelligence Division with more than 15 years of experience running double-agent operations and dismantling KGB networks operating on American soil. She had worked cases in New York, San Francisco, and Washington, and she had developed a reputation within the Bureau for methodical precision and an ability to maintain operational security even under Elena Dmitrievna Volkov, circumstances where most investigations would have been compromised by bureaucratic interference. She sat across from Robert at his kitchen table, a notepad open in front of her, and listened without interruption as he recounted the arrival of the photograph, the confrontation with Elena, and the discovery of the communication equipment. Her expression remained neutral throughout, though Robert noticed that she made frequent notes in a shorthand he could not decipher, and that she paid particular attention when he described Elena's admission that her sons in the Soviet Union had been used as leverage to ensure her cooperation. When Robert finished, Devereaux asked a series of questions that revealed the depth of analysis already underway. She wanted to know if Elena had returned to the house since leaving that morning. She asked about Elena's daily routines, her contacts, the friends she claimed to be staying with. She inquired about Robert's work schedule, the sensitivity of the materials he had access to, and whether he had discussed classified information with Elena in recent weeks. Each question was delivered in the same measured tone, clinical and precise. The assessment Devereaux provided was both clarifying and devastating. Elena Volkov represented what the FBI classified as a long-term illegal, a deep-cover operative inserted into American society with a manufactured identity and assigned to gather intelligence over an extended period, potentially decades. The value of such an asset to Soviet intelligence was immeasurable, not because of any single piece of information she might provide, but because of the cumulative intelligence she could collect over years of patient cultivation. The damage assessment would take months to complete, requiring a comprehensive review of every project Robert had worked on since 1961. But Devereaux made it clear that the immediate priority was not damage assessment, it was operational exploitation. Elena had not been arrested that night, and she would not be arrested in the immediate future because an arrest would alert her KGB handlers that the network had been compromised and would trigger emergency protocols designed to protect other assets before the FBI could identify them. Instead, Elena would be approached, confronted with the evidence of her exposure, and offered a choice. She could cooperate with the FBI, operating as a double agent under controlled conditions, or she could face prosecution under espionage statutes that carried penalties including life imprisonment. The controlled operation began on the morning of June 6th, 2 days after Robert's initial contact with the FBI. Elena was located at a motel in Arlington, registered under a false name but easily identified through surveillance established within hours of Devereaux's arrival. 2 agents approached her in the parking lot as she returned to her room with coffee and a newspaper. The confrontation was brief. Elena was informed that her husband had provided the FBI with a tape recording of her confession, that physical evidence of her espionage activities had been recovered, and that she was being given one opportunity to avoid prosecution by cooperating fully. Elena agreed to cooperate within 15 minutes, though Devereaux's assessment was that Elena's agreement stemmed not from genuine willingness, but from a calculated understanding that cooperation offered the best chance of survival and possibly eventual extraction by her KGB handlers once the immediate crisis had passed. The terms of her cooperation were explicit. Elena would return to her home and resume normal routines. She would make no attempt to contact her handlers unless specifically instructed by the FBI. She would provide complete details about her recruitment, training, operational methods, and the identity of every KGB officer she had worked with over the past 25 years, and she would submit to continuous surveillance for as long as the FBI deemed necessary. Robert was informed of these arrangements during a meeting at the FBI's Washington field office on the afternoon of June 7th. Devereaux explained that he would be required to continue living with Elena, to act as though their marriage was intact, and to maintain the appearance of normalcy for the benefit of any surveillance that Elena's handlers might be conducting. Robert would be equipped with a recording device, a compact unit that could be concealed beneath his clothing and would capture all conversations within a 15-foot radius. He would meet with FBI agents twice weekly to provide updates, and he would report immediately any indication that Elena was attempting to communicate with her handlers. The psychological toll of this arrangement became apparent within the first week. Robert returned to work at Advanced Systems Research Corporation on June 8th, his security clearance temporarily maintained pending the outcome of the investigation, though he had been reassigned to projects involving no classified materials. He came home each evening to find Elena preparing dinner, their son doing homework at the kitchen table, the rhythms of domestic life continuing as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The conversations Robert had with Elena were stilted and careful, each word weighed for the benefit of the recording device he wore. Elena moved through the house like a performer executing a script, her gestures and expressions carefully modulated. The FBI's investigation expanded rapidly. Analysts traced the photograph sent from Vienna to a former KGB officer named Yuri Filipov, who had defected to the West in late 1981 and was living under CIA protection in Austria. Filipov had worked in the KGB's first chief directorate, responsible for foreign intelligence operations, and he had maintained access to files on illegals operating in North America. His decision to send the photograph to Robert had not been authorized by American intelligence services, but had been an act of personal revenge against handlers who Filipov claimed had betrayed him during his final months in Moscow. Surveillance of Elena intensified as FBI technical specialists installed listening devices throughout the Caldwell home and positioned agents in unmarked vehicles outside. What they observed over the next 3 weeks confirmed Devereaux's initial suspicions. Elena had been preparing for emergency extraction. She had withdrawn cash from multiple bank accounts, accumulating nearly $14,000 in small bills stored throughout the house. She had obtained a false passport, discovered during a search conducted while she was at work, concealed inside the lining of a winter coat, and she had made 3 trips to locations in Northern Virginia later identified as potential dead drop sites, though no materials were deposited during those visits. The pattern suggested that Elena had known exposure was imminent, possibly for weeks before the photograph arrived, and that she had been executing contingency plans established by her handlers for precisely this scenario. What remained unclear was whether those handlers were aware that Elena had been compromised and were preparing to extract her, or whether they had decided she represented too great a risk and had abandoned her. The operation was designated Nightfall, and it was scheduled to execute on the afternoon of July 2, 1982, at the Tysons Corner Center Shopping Mall, a sprawling commercial complex located approximately 8 miles west of Washington, D.C. along the Capitol Beltway. The location had been selected by FBI planners because it offered multiple entry and exit points, sufficient civilian foot traffic to provide cover for surveillance teams, and open sight lines across the parking areas that would allow photographic documentation of any individuals who approached the designated exchange point. Special Agent Margaret Devereaux briefed the operational parameters during a planning session held at the FBI's Washington field office on the morning of June 29th. Elena Volkov would be instructed to activate an emergency signal protocol that she had described during her debriefings, a system designed to alert her KGB handler that she possessed time-sensitive intelligence requiring immediate transfer. The signal involved placing a piece of red adhesive tape on a specific telephone pole along Route 7, approximately 2 miles from the mall, on any given Monday. According to Elena's testimony, her handler checked that location twice weekly and would respond by leaving a chalk mark on a mailbox near the Tysons Corner metro station, confirming that an exchange would occur within 48 hours at a predetermined site. The intelligence Elena would claim to possess was fabricated by technical specialists at the National Security Agency in collaboration with FBI counterintelligence analysts. The material consisted of falsified technical specifications for a satellite surveillance system purportedly under development for deployment in 1984, complete with trajectory data, camera resolution capabilities, and encryption protocols. The documents were sophisticated enough to appear legitimate under cursory examination, but contained subtle errors and inconsistencies that would become apparent to Soviet analysts upon detailed review, rendering the information useless for operational purposes while preserving the integrity of actual American satellite programs. Elena placed the red tape on the designated telephone pole on the morning of June 28th, under FBI surveillance that documented the action from 3 separate angles using telephoto lenses. The chalk mark appeared on the mailbox 36 hours later, on the evening of June 29th, precisely as Elena had predicted. The exchange was confirmed for 3 in the afternoon on July 2nd at the northwest corner of the Tyson's Corner Center parking lot, near a row of newspaper vending machines positioned between the Woodward and Lothrop and Bloomingdale's entrances. The surveillance deployment began at noon on July 2nd. FBI agents dressed as shoppers and positioned throughout the parking lot and inside the mall established overlapping coverage of the exchange point. Additional personnel occupied the upper levels of the parking garage with cameras equipped for long-range photography. Unmarked vehicles were stationed at each of the mall's 5 vehicular exits, prepared to establish mobile surveillance on any individual who departed the area following contact with Elena. Representatives from the CIA's Counterintelligence Center were present as observers, positioned in a mobile command van parked 300 yards from the exchange site, monitoring radio communications and providing real-time analysis of any personnel who appeared to match profiles of known or suspected Soviet intelligence officers operating in the Washington area. Elena arrived at 2:47, driving her own vehicle and parking in a space that provided clear visibility to surveillance teams. She carried a shopping bag from Garfinkel's department store, inside which was a manila envelope containing the falsified satellite specifications. She exited her vehicle, walked slowly toward the newspaper vending machines, and stood there, pretending to read the headlines visible through the glass panels while glancing occasionally at her watch. At 3:04, a man approached from the direction of the Bloomingdale's entrance. He was approximately 50 years old, medium height, wearing a dark suit and carrying a briefcase. Surveillance photographs taken during the approach later identified him as Viktor Petrov, a second secretary at the Soviet embassy in Washington, a diplomatic position that provided cover for intelligence activities and granted him immunity from arrest under international law. Petrov walked past Elena without making eye contact, paused at the vending machines as if considering a purchase, and then continued walking toward a row of parked cars 20 yards away. Elena waited 10 seconds, as she had been instructed by the FBI, then walked in the same direction Petrov had taken. She placed the shopping bag on the ground beside a green sedan, turned, and walked back toward her own vehicle. Petrov, who had been standing near a newspaper kiosk, moved toward the sedan and bent down as if tying his shoe. His hand reached out toward the shopping bag. The operation began to collapse at 3:07. A second vehicle, a dark blue van that had not been present during the initial surveillance sweep, pulled into the parking lot at high speed and stopped abruptly 30 feet from where Petrov was positioned. 3 men emerged, scanning the area with the practiced efficiency of trained counter-surveillance operatives. One of them pointed directly at an FBI agent positioned near the Woodward and Lothrop entrance, identifying him despite his civilian clothing and his attempt to blend into the flow of shoppers. Petrov straightened immediately, leaving the shopping bag untouched, and walked rapidly toward the Soviet embassy van. FBI agents moved to intercept, but Devereaux, monitoring from the command vehicle, issued orders over the radio to hold position and avoid physical contact. Petrov possessed diplomatic immunity. Any attempt to detain him would trigger an international incident and potentially compromise other ongoing counterintelligence operations. The decision was made to let him go and focus instead on apprehending the counter-surveillance team, who did not enjoy diplomatic protection and could be arrested on charges of obstruction. But Elena, watching the chaos unfold and recognizing that the operation had failed, made a decision that no one in the FBI had anticipated. She ran. Not toward her vehicle, but toward the opposite end of the parking lot, moving with speed that suggested she had rehearsed this contingency, that she had been preparing for the possibility of escape since the moment she had agreed to cooperate with federal authorities. FBI agents pursued on foot while others scrambled to reposition vehicles to cut off her route. She was apprehended at 3:11, tackled to the pavement by 2 agents as she attempted to reach a secondary exit that led to Route 7. During the subsequent search, conducted in the back of an FBI vehicle as the parking lot was secured and civilian witnesses were moved away from the scene, agents discovered documents concealed in Elena's clothing. The documents were not the falsified satellite specifications she had been instructed to pass. They were genuine classified materials, photocopies of technical assessments related to signals intelligence operations that Robert Caldwell had been working on during the previous month, materials he had briefly brought home to review over a weekend and that Elena had apparently copied without his knowledge. The realization settled over the FBI team with cold clarity. Elena had not been cooperating in good faith. She had been using the controlled operation as cover to prepare for defection, and she had intended to bring Robert's latest work with her as a final offering to her KGB handlers, intelligence that would have been catastrophic for American operations and would have justified the risk of extracting a compromised asset. Elena Volkov was formally charged with espionage on July 8, 1982, 6 days after her attempted flight from the Tysons Corner parking lot. The indictment filed in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia contained 14 counts including conspiracy to commit espionage, unauthorized transmission of classified defense information to a foreign government, and making false statements to federal investigators. The charges carried a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. Her arraignment was brief, conducted under heavy security with federal marshals positioned throughout the courtroom, and she entered a plea of not guilty on the advice of her court-appointed attorney. Though the evidence against her was overwhelming and included her own recorded confession, the physical materials recovered from her home, and testimony from Robert Caldwell, who had been granted limited immunity from prosecution in exchange for his cooperation. The trial began on October 18, 1982, and lasted 17 days. Federal prosecutors presented a methodical case, calling 43 witnesses including FBI agents, NSA analysts, Robert Caldwell, and several of Robert's colleagues from Advanced Systems Research Corporation who testified about the sensitivity of the materials Elena had been exposed to during her marriage. The defense strategy, such as it was, focused on portraying Elena as a victim of coercion, a woman who had been blackmailed by Soviet intelligence and forced to betray her adopted country under threat of harm to her sons. But the prosecution countered with evidence that Elena had continued her espionage activities for more than 2 decades, long past any reasonable point where she might have sought help from American authorities, and that her final attempt to defect with classified materials demonstrated her ongoing allegiance to Soviet intelligence. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts. On November 12, 1982, Elena Volkov was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. She showed no emotion as the sentence was read, standing motionless with her hands clasped in front of her expression blank and distant as if she had already removed herself mentally from the proceedings and retreated to some interior space where the judge's words could not reach her. The media coverage destroyed what remained of Robert Caldwell's life. His name appeared in newspapers across the country, identified as the defense contractor whose wife had been spying for the Soviet Union for more than 20 years. Despite his cooperation with the FBI, despite the immunity he had been granted, his security clearance was revoked on November 20, 1982, effectively ending his career in signals intelligence. Advanced Systems Research Corporation terminated his employment 3 days later, citing the impossibility of maintaining him in any position that did not require access to classified materials. His colleagues avoided him. His neighbors looked at him with suspicion. His daughter withdrew from college and returned home, unable to cope with the attention and the questions from other students. His son became withdrawn, silent, spending hours alone in his room. Robert found work eventually as a technical writer for a small firm that produced instructional manuals for commercial electronics, a position that paid less than half what he had earned before and required none of the expertise he had spent decades developing. He moved his family to a smaller house in a different suburb, hoping distance might provide some measure of anonymity, but the story followed them. They were the family of the Soviet spy, and that identity proved impossible to escape. The full truth about Elena's sons in the Soviet Union emerged slowly, pieced together through CIA backchannels during the late 1980s as Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika began to open channels of communication that had been closed for decades. Through contacts established during negotiations over other espionage cases, Robert learned that Alexei and Viktor Volkov had lived under KGB supervision their entire lives, monitored constantly to ensure their mother's compliance. They had been told in 1958 that their mother had died in an accident, a story maintained by Soviet authorities to prevent them from asking questions or attempting to contact her. They had grown up in communal apartments in Minsk, working ordinary jobs, unaware that their mother was alive and operating as an intelligence asset in America. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, Robert made contact through an intermediary, a journalist who had covered Cold War espionage cases and who agreed to help locate Elena's sons. The first letter took 6 months to reach them. Their response when it came was cautious but not hostile. They wanted to know about their mother, about the family she had built in America, about the half-siblings they had never known existed. Robert traveled to Moscow in October 1994. He met Alexei and Viktor in a cafe near Red Square, 2 men in their 50s with weathered faces and guarded expressions. He brought photographs of their half-siblings, images of graduations and weddings and grandchildren. The meeting lasted 3 hours. There were no embraces, no tears, only quiet conversation and the slow recognition of shared tragedy. There were fragments of families that had been shattered by the machinery of Cold War espionage, connected by blood but separated by history and ideology and choices made decades earlier. Elena Volkov was released from federal prison on November 12, 2012, having served exactly 30 years. She was 75 years old, frail and gray-haired, and she was immediately deported to Russia under terms negotiated between American and Russian authorities. She was reunited with her sons in Moscow, elderly men now themselves, strangers bound together by loss. Photographs of the reunion appeared in Russian newspapers, showing an old woman embracing two old men in an airport terminal. Robert Caldwell never spoke to her again. He died in 2018 at age 88, in a nursing facility in Richmond, Virginia, survived by his 2 children and 4 grandchildren who carried the weight of a story they had not chosen but could not escape.